forums, and I'd like to do another one in January and do 2 a year, simply to gather and unite people that would consider themselves leaders in our congregation. We have so many different corners, and for communication, for unity, for vision casting, and also for your input, kind of an open time, and a little bit later there'll be a group time to be able to do some of that. But that's the purpose tonight. I wanted to be very inclusive, so we had just an open invitation for anybody to come, really. I mean, if you consider yourself a member, you self-nominate in, or a leader, come in. With that, a little bit about the change in our society. I don't want to talk too much about it, but if you look at there's a sheet that you maybe picked up on the way in. If you pull that out, you see the name Alan Hirsch. I mentioned a couple weeks ago that I was at the Sent Conference for Lutheran Ministers in Detroit, and there was a speaker, Alan Hirsch. He's a missiologist. He's not Lutheran, but he's from South Africa, Australia. He lived for a while, but he does a lot of research, written some books on, in particular, trends in Christianity in the Western world. And so just some notes from him, just to give you some context on the change that we're experiencing in our culture, and many of this you may know. So this is from him. First of all, he says, in the first century, the church was at the margin of society. It was a persecuted minority at the margins of society. I think we all kind of understand that in the book of Acts. The 16th century, from which our Lutheran tradition was born out of, the Reformation, really the church was at the center of society. Martin Luther wasn't necessarily a missionary in that purest sense. He was reforming an existing system. So the system was in place, politically, societally, religiously. There was a whole system in place, an education system to local parishes, and he was working within that system on reform. It was the Reformation. In fact, he didn't want a Lutheran church. He wanted to reform the one church. That didn't happen, but, well, I think in some ways it has happened, but he did not intend for there to be a Lutheran church named after him. But anyway, that happened within the structure of a churched society. It was Christendom. Everybody was kind of Christian for the most part, even peasants. They may not have known much, but they were considered a Christian world, in the Western world at least. Now, in the 21st century, it appears that the church is returning to the margins again. But the interesting thing is that Hirsch notes is that we're still structured like we're in a churched society. Now, in America, there still is a lot of heartland. There still is a lot of the structure and the establishment of a kind of a Christian culture yet. I wouldn't say that we're persecuted. I mean, go to Iraq. I mean, we're not talking about that. That's persecution. But we are becoming more and more marginalized in terms of society, and that's become evident over time. But we're still structured like we're in a system where the church is the center of society. He goes on to draw this little diagram here, the 60-40. 18% of Americans are in church on any given Sunday, roughly 18%. Up to 40% of Americans are receptive to attending a church. It doesn't mean that they're in church every Sunday, but about 40% would consider walking in the doors of a church like this, and might on Christmas and Easter. About 40%. What he says really is that there's another 60% of Americans as a whole who are really unreceptive, maybe not necessarily hostile, but just, it would be like if somebody asked you to go to the mosque down the street. Somebody said, hey, why don't you come to my mosque on Friday for prayer? You'd say, that would be the last place I would. Why would I go to the mosque with you? For about 60% of the population, that's kind of what, you may respect it, well that's fine, I'm glad you go to church, but really I'm not gonna go there. So this 60%, while not Christian maybe in an Orthodox sense, for the most part, studies show that they have a positive view of God. 90-some% of Americans believe in God. Now, define that God, that's a different matter, but there are actually not as many atheists as I think we think there might be. But there's a positive view of God, positive view of spirituality. Again, it may not be what we would define as Christian spirituality, but spirituality, and actually positive views of Jesus. At least he was a good guy, a positive historical figure. What they don't have a positive view of is the church. So a positive view of God, spirituality, Jesus, but not the church. Alan Hirsch says, they like your product, but they don't like where they're buying it. That's what he said. So That's just reflective for us to be mindful of. He also notes that this 40% is diminishing rapidly. So the 40% is soon will be 35 and 30 and diminishing. And we're seeing that in the Pew research that's coming out, especially on millennial generation, in terms of declaring themselves as nuns, no religious affiliation. And the interesting thing is that most churches are fighting for the same 40% people. So people will say, well, that big church down the street, what are they doing? We should do what they're doing. Essentially, if you just put on a bigger, better show, you get the 40% kind of shifts around. So I like the preacher better. Well, they're still part of the 40%, but they just go over here. Or the music is better over here, or the program is better over here. And so really, he notes, and I see this anecdotally in local churches, is there's just shifting of Christians. You see a new church and it grows rapidly. I'm not saying that there wouldn't be conversions there, but there's a lot of just Christians moving around. So the question is, how do you engage the 60% and soon to be the 70%? It's a big bridge to cross, and that gets to the heart a bit of what loved and sent are for us. Loved and sent, I think, are challenging us to engage the 60%. That's hard. But I think they're poking at us, those words. God is saying, you are loved enough. You are grounded. You have something so great. You have this gospel that I've given to you. You proclaim it well as Lutheran Christians. It's a gift. You are loved. And now, go. There's at least 60% who don't know that, who don't understand that, who are living, operating under different circumstances and are living in fear, shame, or guilt. If you look on the back side of or the other side of that page, just a little outline on the upcoming series. So we're going to start simply by going a little bit deeper with these words. And so we're going to have a very focused season of study and prayer on Sundays with preaching and worship that you'll see, and it will follow this outline. So we'll start this Sunday. We'll start talking about loved, and then we're going to work through kind of a handles on the gospel. What does it mean to be loved by God? I think we need to be able to speak the gospel clearly, concisely, consistently before we're sent. And so talking about how we're loved by God in His presence, pardon, and power, manger, cross, and crown, we'll work through that. Hopefully give you some language to be able to use. First of all, to hear the gospel yourself, and second of all, to be able to speak it back into the lives of other people. On the 11th of October, which is a Saturday, a big, giant mini-mission trip called the Love Sent Servant Event, which you'll hear about in just a minute. And on the 12th, Unified Worship. We had a good experience in February with Unified Worship, and we'll look to do that about once a year. And so that'll be the 12th. So that's just a peek into the upcoming series. It also comes with, we have a devotional resource that you'll get on Sunday that your staff has compiled and worked on, and you'll get that. That will kind of be a way for you to take the series into the week. And so we'll begin this series this coming Sunday.